how to solve a problem when it's not written, when something is not written. That's the fascinating way of thinking about a problem. If you do not have the solution written somewhere, how do you approach it? I have a real treat for you guys today. I have here Craig Smith. Craig, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks. Glad to be here.
All right, Craig. So here are three things you should definitely know about my guest today. First of all, he is the author of this amazing book, the Car Hackers Handbook. This is the first car hackers book I've ever bought, and I think it is the first car hacker book that ever existed. And this is the favorite car hacker book till today. So Craig, amazing work. I'm a big fan. So that's number one. Number two, Craig works as a CISO for corporations. CISO meaning Chief Information Security Officer. So that's the second thing you should definitely know about Craig. And the third thing is he makes games. So without further ado, Craig, I want you to tell our audience a little bit about yourself, about these three things that I just mentioned, and what inspired you, first of all, to write this book, a little bit about your CISO activities, and of course, about your hobby of making games.
All right. Long story. I mean, I've been into security for all my life for the most part. So I've gone through the trenches, done all the things from exploit development, reverse engineering, worked for a lot of different groups, companies, and consultants. And at some point in time, I think this was 2007, maybe, I started to work on car hacking. And it came about because I had done some reverse engineering on an infotainment center. I had a job where I was driving at the time. I lived in Ohio, and I go from Cincinnati to Dayton, which is about an hour and a half drive. So I bought at the time a newer hybrid vehicle. And this is the first time I had a car that had like a screen in it, which is super common now. But back then it was basically a radio prior to that. And so I was like, wow, this is cool, a little computer here. So of course I want to hack it. I mean, what else would I do with a radio? So during this drive, I was thinking about it, and I figured out how to reverse engineer it. I figured out how to get my own stuff running on it, and then I posted it online of how I went through this process and how I did it, and just some of the unique things I found in this little weekend trip I was doing on my car. But that got the attention of a couple other people. At the time, there was a group in Columbus, just coincidentally in the same state, that was making a pretty unique thing. They were bringing in high school students that were recommended by their teachers as like excelling in academics and robotics, to come in for a week from a bunch of different high schools to this facility, and they were going to teach them how to hack cars. And which is like going to be a 24/7 thing all week. So they approached me about being a mentor for this, and I was like, this sounds fascinating. I love this idea. But at the time I was like, I don't really work on cars. I hacked the infotainment center, which is basically a computer. It wasn't that big of a deal. And they're like, oh no, cars are easy. Like it's like, you'll be fine. I was like, okay, we'll see. And so I was like, the whole goal is really just to teach them how to think out of the box, how to think when there isn't books written on topics, because there definitely wasn't at that time. And which is a hard thing to do, especially with students. I mean, you grow up and all the way through college, learning everything from books for the most part. So if something's not written yet, how do you solve that problem? And so that was useful. So I said I would go and do this. And we went there. We spent a week with the kids, and teaching them everything, teaching them Wi-Fi hacking, reverse engineering, electronics, just the gamut. And then on Thursday night, they would go all night hacking on some cars. On Friday, they would report on it. And they have findings. Unfortunately, everything's under NDA, so I can't say what they did or did not find. But it was a success and kind of inspired me. I was like, that was really cool and really fun. And I decided, like, this isn't hard, and we could definitely use security people in these other fields that they're not traditionally in. And so that's when I started writing the Car Hackers Handbook, so that people can have that introductory thing, the experience I basically just had with the kids. I want to share that with other people. And so that is the genesis of that book.
Fantastic story. So any idea why these people particularly wanted to hack a car? What inspired them?
So
Because you're
there,
talking about 2007, right? In
yeah,
2007, car hacking was not a thing.
correct, correct. So this group, what they do a lot of work, typically government-like work, not always, but typically. And so they're a typical group that would think outside the box. They were looking into this back then.
Yeah.
And there wasn't talent for it, which is a large part of it. So they had kind of and this is my opinion. Like I wasn't there when they set this up, so I don't really know what all went into it. But from what I observed, it seemed that the purpose of this was to both identify good talent that could work in this space, but also bring awareness to the car companies that this was a thing as well. They wanted to get into this, and they have this catch-22 problem here of this demand. And so they had, I don't know who came up with this, but had this experimental idea to do this. And they actually ran this program for about 5 or 6 years, I think. And so every year they would do this because it was successful. It was good. And the kids liked it. The auto industry was invited to come and watch as well. So they would be there. So everybody's getting stuff out of this. And it ended up being a good program. But that's my guess as to why they launched it. But I don't know the insights for sure.
All right, so I'm going to go to the CISO and the game making things a little later because you mentioned so many stimulating points. One thing that you mentioned is you taught the students how to solve a problem when it's not written, when something is not written. That's the fascinating way of thinking about a problem. If you do not have the solution written somewhere, how do you approach it? Can you tell our audience your general philosophy, not only for hacking, in your general philosophy that you have learned throughout your hacking experience, teaching these students that if there is a problem that is unknown to us, we don't know how to, it's not written somewhere, how do we solve that problem?
Yeah, this one's actually a tough one. And it's not because it's hard to solve, it's because we're just not wired that way. If we can't Google search something nowadays, then we're just like, well, I guess can't be done. Yeah, impossible.
Yeah.
That's silly. Of course, somebody has to write it the first time through anyway. And so it's a mindset thing, and it takes, so to teach typically, to teach this type of thing, you wait till there's a problem and you have to walk them through how they would do this. Like, how would you solve this? Which typically, and I don't have this like written down, so I don't have a free way of explaining it. So let me ramble a little bit, I guess. But you'll usually go through a situation where you've run into a situation where you can't look it up, you don't know this answer. And so what you have to do is you have to kind of roll backwards a bit and understand the foundation of what's going on. And without a problem right in front of me right now, I'll just make up something, but it could be things such as like understanding, okay, like I want to do this thing with a wireless protocol. So how does the source code for the wireless protocol work? Like a great resource is Linux. Linux has source code for just about anything. So let's get the driver source code and let's start reading through this. We'll look through things there that, depending on what you're going for, maybe you're looking at, wireless signals. Maybe you want to, I don't know, look for a buffer overflow or something of that nature. So you may need some background stuff of what you're trying to accomplish, but now you have the source to start to understand this chipset. Maybe look at other chipsets. And then once you have those, then you start experimenting with things, and you have to get used to it's failure, but once you're in this process, it doesn't really seem that way. It's just trying things. It's like when you're working on a puzzle and you have to like free two links from each other. And so you're really just flipping it around and pulling on it and whatnot. Technically, you're failing every time you're flipping those around and pulling on them. but eventually you'll get it right and you'll get a little bit of movement. You're like, okay, I've gotten somewhere, and then you'll fidget some more and you get somewhere. That process is the same. So you'll start reverse engineering something, you'll start to understand the foundations of things more as you just try, beat your head against the wall a little bit, and then things will start to click, and you'll click again, and you'll move forward, and before you know it, you'll have your solution. And it is a unique solution. It's something that nobody else has done before. And that's a really nice and great feeling.
Fascinating, fascinating. All right, let's go to your CISO activities. So from a hacker and then teaching hacking, a book author, and well, you're very well known in the car hacking community. I've I wanted to have you in my podcast ever since I had your book. I think um, I sent you out even LinkedIn connection request. Somehow I don't know if you got it or somewhere. I couldn't reach you. Anyway, so how did you get into the CISO thing where so much non-technical, so much of the policy strategy work, and how did that transition happen?
How does that happen? Let me think. Well, I've definitely gone through a bunch of technical things. And it's one of those things where, like I'd mentioned, I've done like exploit development, I've done reverse engineering, I've done pen testing, the blue teaming stuff. And I think at some point in time, you start managing teams, and then I believe somebody had pinged me to do a CISO role, and I did not end up getting that job, but it really made me start thinking about it more. And I decided, like, I do want to try this. It's something I haven't done before, and I like managing. I like working with people. And so I wanted to get into that. So what was my first gig like this? I think it was for a car company, which makes sense. So I was working for an electrical car company that was starting out, and they got consumed. They're no more. So I'm not going to say their name, but at the time they wanted to have some very custom, secure devices within the vehicle as well. So it made sense to kind of bring me in to this because I have the technical knowledge and I can oversee things. And so I think that's where it started. And so it's more like, I think it started as kind of like a director kind of role, senior director, but there wasn't anybody else. So it was just that. And then it became, I think I think shortly after that one, I ended up working for Bird, the scooter company. And for them, they were a startup and they wanted to IPO. So they needed things like SOC 2 and ISO and some more of those things. So spent a lot of time understanding the compliance aspect of different things, and a lot of that. The nice thing, the pro and con of having the background I do when going into a CISO role, the problem from what it really is. The difficulty is most of the compliance stuff is pretty far behind. They'll have a bunch of things to do. They're basically like checklists. And they were probably great 10 years ago, but they're not really necessary now, or you're doing something just totally different now that is just the next step, and they're just not caught up yet. And you have to appease both sides. So you still have to do it, but you're kind of going back and just adding extra things for the sake of adding extra things. And so that's definitely a bit of a struggle. And a lot of the people that are my peers don't have the same kind of background as I do. They may come from another area of management or something of that nature. So, they're good at talking the talk, but I think a lot of times they listen a lot to vendors because that's their main source of learning, and it can be the wrong information. They end up buying a lot of tools they don't need or don't use, and so it's a bit of a challenge to kind of work through from a functional CISO level to explain to, like, even your insurance at the end of the year, like when you're doing your cyber insurance, how whatever you're doing still matches, Like they're thinking like, oh well, we require 7 characters for passwords. You're like, okay, cool, I'll check that box, but that's not really what's protecting my accounts. And we're doing all these extra things to protect accounts. And so, I have to then kind of go to bat to kind of try and get that price down, because we are doing more than just what you had asked for, and then explaining how it's more to non-technical people. And so it's an interesting place to be when you have this background.
Absolutely, absolutely. So you brought up a lot of other stimulating points, but before we dive into those, I want to touch base on your hobby you mentioned. You make games.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So from a hobby perspective, I like doing 3D artwork. I do usually realism type pieces of people, and then I also make games. And so the realistic people don't necessarily go into the games because it takes a lot on processing power to make those work real time. But obviously I can make simpler ones, and I typically use Unreal Engine or Godot, which is an open source game engine, for different things. And I've done 3D. I mix the two together sometimes. For one year at DEF CON, there was a VR challenge where you hack a van, and you did it in VR, and that was all written in Godot by me. It's a solo developer. And right now I'm working on an Android kind of game for role playing. So if you want to ever role playing games that you don't have a GM for, a dungeon master for, I'm making an app to help you out with that. And it's not just a tie into ChatGPT. It actually is based for things that are useful for gaming on your own.
Wow, love that, love that. Wow, so a book author, a professional car hacker, CISO, and a game maker from heart. I've never seen such combination. Amazing. I'm really amazed. So today we want to talk a little bit because my audience, they're probably most interested in your car hacking background, because I'm sure most of you have seen this book. Those of you who haven't seen it, if you want to get into car hacking, this is where you got to start. My team started also, based on your book. We've done a lot ever since, but this was the starting. So when you're hacking a car, walk us through the steps. If someone from the audience wants to start, hacking into a car, and this is a podcast. It's not going to be a tutorial. So we want to go a little bit high level, mostly the philosophy, the steps. How would you go about it?
Okay. Let's see. So it kind of depends. There's like two main camps that I think tend to hack cars. You have your security professionals who are interested in understanding vulnerabilities and things of that nature. And then you have your repair people. The right to repair is usually what I work with a lot. People who want to make a modification, could be performance tuning, could be to fix or improve something. They also have to hack the vehicle to do it because it's just not open. So it kind of depends on your goal. Typically, what I would do, probably regardless of which camp you're in, typically what I'll do is I will go to a junkyard and I will look for a good target car vehicle, and I'll pull out the components that I want to target. There's a little bit to it as to which ones you need to grab, but it's not too difficult. You basically need a wiring diagram and some spare time. It's a bunch of tools too to pull things apart. If you've never done it before, it's very therapeutic to go to a junkyard. You get to basically be very rough with the vehicles because nobody's going to be driving these vehicles. So go ahead and smash things up. If you can't get that part out, cut the dashboard out. Doesn't matter. It's great. One thing I would suggest is if you're pulling out components, do not disconnect them. Leave them connected in and pull as hard as you can so that wire's long and stretched. And then take a bolt cutter and just cut them off. So you have like a pigtail of wires, because you're going to want to be able to connect to certain wires. And instead of trying to reconnect that connector to the ones you need, just have those extra wires available. Most of the stuff for hacking purposes isn't what people typically buy from a junkyard. So That's another thing you can use to your advantage. You'll come up with all these weird components and you'll drop them off. Maybe you're taking the immobilizer or something. Most people don't want that because you can't mix and match immobilizers. But as a security person, you probably do. And immobilizers for locking and unlocking the car. So you put those up on the counter. They usually have no idea what the price of these things are because it's not a normal thing people buy. So just haggle with them. Like I think this is about $20. If I've walked away so many times with a lot of stuff for like $20. And then you will have to take a wiring diagram and wire up the components yourself. But then you have a very safe and easy way to just work on things and start reverse engineering them. And again, it doesn't cost you that much. It's mainly time. If you mess it up, no big deal. Just go back, get some more.
Wow. So you went to junkyard and bought and you really took out the ECUs and the wires and stuff and brought it home. Wow, this is something I actually never thought about. What we did is in our lab, we bought two cars, pretty old cars, and we performed our hacking there. So okay, once you buy those pieces, you connect it with an OBD2 port, right?
Yes. I also grabbed that as well. And so I pulled one of those out. You can always just buy the port, I guess, but I pulled that out as well. You're there. You don't reconnect the entire bus. You just would find things like, for instance, a CAN bus line, and then you would tie those together, and then you'll connect your sniffer to that. And that's how it works. I mean, I do recommend on occasion, at least when you're first looking at things, it is pretty easy to just get into a car, a physical car, and attach a CAN sniffer, and look at the traffic and get a feeling for what's going on. That is very useful. It kind of gets you over that initial overwhelming step of like, oh, where do I start? But it is, as you've probably learned, getting the cars, you have a lot that you're dealing with and contending with. There's a lot of ECUs, there's a lot of chatter, things you don't need to really deal with. That if you want to focus on something, it's hard to focus with a whole vehicle. So that's where a test bench is what's called when you pull parts out. That's where a test bench is useful. If you only have a car, you don't want to go through this. Pulling out fuses is another way to kind of help with that. Look at your fuse diagram, disconnect fuses for the components you don't think you need. And then that will reduce some of the chatter happening on the network. So you can kind of focus a little bit better.
Wow, mind blowing. So what are the tools you need to get started with the thing that you will get from a junkyard? What tools do you need? Do you need a canoe or what do you need?
I think for CAN, yeah, I mean canoe is fine. Any kind of like USB CAN device is decent. There was one I used to use. I'm trying to think of the vendor name. It has an 8 in it, a number 8. The reason why I use them is because they were like 50 or 60 bucks. Linux would see it as a CAN interface, which I prefer. So the thing is, with some of the cheaper devices, it'll show up as what's called an SL CAN, and that's a serial link CAN device. And they're fine, they work, but they're a little bit slower, and you have to now deal with this extra middle layer because what's going on is the device itself isn't showing up as a native CAN interface to Linux, but it's showing up as more like a serial CAN interface. And so there's a serial communication that happens to the CAN device that tells that CAN device, to start sniffing or whatever you're doing, and then it translates it back. So it's an extra layer you have to kind of troubleshoot if things aren't going well. I think the company is called like 8 devices or something, but you don't necessarily have to spend a bunch of money. I would probably budget out like $100 just because that gives you some flexibility to get something a little nicer, or things are just not in stock sometimes and you have to kind of go up a bit.
Got it. So
yeah.
that's what you need. All right. So and then like what we do is we talk about a 6-step process. Like the first thing is you have to penetrate the vehicle. Somehow you have to have access. This can be a physical access, and you put we connect it to the OBD2 port, or somehow you have to access the vehicle to get to the CAN bus, right? It could be remote, it could be physical. Then what you do is you sniff. Sniffing is the next step. Then the third step is you start understanding, kind of reverse engineer. You reverse engineer the canned messages. And once you understand and reverse engineer the canned messages, now you can perform your attack. The attack can be, you design your attack, and for the attack you assemble your own canned packets. That is like the attacker's packets, and you put it in the, and then you can do anything. There's no limit. There is no limit to it, depending on the vehicle. Now, my question to you is: this is what I get pretty often. When I don't have physical access, what do I do?
Okay, so when you don't have physical access, that sounds to me like you're asking a security question for penetration testing. So, okay, so this isn't for research then. So you've already done your research. You've already figured out your attacks. So this is the way to do it. Like you're not going to break into a car remotely and then start analyzing it and figuring out that's not going to work. You're going to have to figure out where your target car is, either make a test bench or buy the car, whatever, figure out your attack. And then if you want to demonstrate a remote payload, which typically you're only really going to do this for a client. And so that client is typically, the car manufacturer. There's a couple of different ways to deploy it. You can use you're gonna have to use wireless. That's just guaranteed because you're not physically attached. And so the two methods, you could technically use Bluetooth, but you'd have to have a vulnerability in the Bluetooth stack, most likely for that. So I don't really see that one too often. There's Wi-Fi in certain vehicles. I've seen this one a couple times. One thing that you can look for, depending on your car, is some vehicles will look for Wi-Fi that is the Wi-Fi of the mechanic shop of the dealerships. They have a set name. And if they see that, they'll automatically connect to it. So that's a method. So you can set up your access point to be what's normally at the dealership and see if the car connects. And then you're going to have remote access to at least the infotainment center there. You still have to get through that hurdle of whatever that is. That's a computer. It doesn't mean it's just open to the CAN. You have to get past that. The other common method to do something like this, and again, this is typically when you've been hired to do this, is you're going to come in through their back-end telematics line. And that can be a wide variety of things, but it's typically going through their network into their system that manages the vehicle's telematics. And then you can come in through the infotainment again to do this. Whenever you're doing like wireless, it's almost always through the infotainment because that's where those receivers are. And so you'll get on there. The good and the bad of that is it's basically a computer. And so once you get onto that, you do have a lot more capabilities and more common freedoms to pivot than you would on ECU itself. Those are embedded systems that are a little bit harder to install tools or anything like that. You're not going to do that on an ECU, but you can do that on an infotainment center.
So to access, you mentioned Bluetooth vulnerabilities, which is not very common. Then you connect to the Wi-Fi. One of them is like, you just mentioned a hack that the workshop name. Then the third one you mentioned is through the network of the OEM's infrastructure and penetrating their telematic unit.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, like, let's say we're done with the access part. Now what? Connecting to the Wi-Fi does not mean I can access CAN right away. So what do I do now?
This is kind of a normal pen testing piece for the infotainment center anyway. If it's Wi-Fi or if it's telematics, then you're going to have certain ports open. Telematics will most likely have a tunneling system to it to get information. It could be API based or it could be SSH. That's actually quite common nowadays to have a full SSH tunnel capabilities from the telematics, from the OEM's spot or whoever's managing their telematics. So you might just want to go after those keys. And then once you figure out how they typically connect, you connect that way. A lot of times, even with their APIs, they may have a interface that their support staff is using to issue certain commands. So The support staff's not SSHing into a car, but the underlying tools are. That's how they go and they execute something. So you will have to go underneath the hood, maybe go through their a good way of doing this is find where the developers keep their wiki pages and just read through those real quick. Search for things like passwords and stuff, and they're like, oh, this is how we do our testing, and, and then you'll know how to do that. And then don't use their interfaces for support. You just use the keys themselves to get in. And so it's just like if you were to break into different servers and you're pivoting through a server network. Very, very similar, almost identical. The only gotchas I think you're going to run into is the infotainment centers can have weird CPUs. So you're going to have to probably compile custom things for them. So you won't be able to bring binaries over. You'll probably have to recompile them, or you can bring binaries if you know what your target's architecture is and precompile it for that. But in general, you'll be limited. For instance, that infotainment center that I first did, my very first one was using an SH4 processor, which is not, a lot of people don't know what that is, but it was like using like the Dreamcast. It's a very odd processor. So the assembly's odd on it, things of that's odd. So even if you find a vulnerability with the kernel or something, you have to keep the architecture in mind if you're going to exploit it. So your typical like Metasploit won't just work. You're going to have to change the payload a bit.
So to access CAN, you mentioned then API is one of the ways you find the keys, how they're sending commands, CAN commands. So you have to look for those either for telematic or infotainment, via the wireless that you just connected, or Bluetooth vulnerabilities, what have you. You have to look for those ports / keys / API to access the canvas.
Your goal is code execution. That's your goal. So whatever method you can get to get code execution on the target, that's what you're shooting for. So anything for that, an RCE is what you're looking for. Once you have that, then you'll have whatever it has access to on the CAN. And then you can use their CAN interface from the infotainment to get to CAN. So
got it. So
one extra step there. This is the you shell, essentially.
All right. So my first target would be then the infotainment ECU. And I want to find out how to execute code there. That's my first goal. And once I'm doing that, now I want to see how do they communicate with CAN.
Yes, that's probably the way you'd want to go. I mean, you could just directly start talking to the CAN bus right then. Like if you already knew what you want to send, I mean, that would just work. But you could also sometimes it would be beneficial to see what libraries they're using, because if there's a more modern car and maybe they've done something special on their CAN bus, maybe they have their own little Mac or signing system, using their libraries will let you wrap your code into the protected code. So it'll go through. Also the infotainment center, their binaries, if you're good at reverse engineering, just grab some of the binaries that are there for understanding what the car does, and you can just read them and kind of see okay, well, here's the CAN IDs for this. Here's how these data is processed, and you don't have to reverse engineer the CAN packets. You can just reverse engineer the binary, which sometimes is a lot easier depending on your skill set, depending how it was compiled. It might have debug symbols in it or strings that you can just look for and go oh, here we go.
Got it. Now imagine that we're kind of successful there. We could access CAN, and now we know how to send CAN. First of all, how to sniff CAN. I can sniff CAN messages probably. Now, when we're sniffing CAN, how do we reverse engineer? Because the car that we have downstairs, there are two cars. I think one of them is from 2012. There's not much of CAN security mechanism. It's so easy to understand and reverse engineer. But when we are talking about a car which are relatively newer, there are a lot of CAN security implemented in it. We have a Mac, probably it's signed. So tell us a little bit about how would you reverse engineer those?
I don't see it too much with those, but that would be for instance, using those libraries. So if you get on the infotainment center, obviously the infotainment center can send those packets just fine. So just use their libraries to send your packets. and then it'll automatically just wrap it. You don't have to reverse engineer. You can get the keys out of it then. If you go that route, then their framework will do it for you. And so I would just go that
But
route.
how would let's say I want to send a packet to dedicated for the ADAS system, let's say. But if I don't know the structure of the ADAS packet, how will I create those packets from the infotainment system?
Well, if your goal for this is you want to maybe you're not coming from entertainment, maybe you have a dongle or something, or you're connected to your laptop and you want to do it, then you will have to understand their signing process, if they're signing it. So you're going to need to get that, and you can get that,
Got it.
pretty much from taking it from an existing one. That's the only way to do that. You're not really, not in a normal time frame, going to be able to reverse engineer the Mac just by looking at it. You're going to want to go right. You're going to go for some binary.
Okay, got it.
If there's any testing tool that can test the ADAS system, like through a routine, that might be a quick, easy way to do that you might have more access to. So, for instance, you could probably buy one of the dealership tools from a closing, dealership relatively cheaply, and reverse engineer that. Might be a quick and easy way to figure out how do they wrap their packets, do they have signing libraries there, and then you would incorporate that into your dongle.
So, I mean, I think you mentioned it already earlier in this talk, that when you're actually accessing through, if you don't have physical access, then you have already figured out the attack. You have already reverse engineered now, because your window of opportunity is not unlimited. And then all you have to do is, access and perform the attack. That's
reverse engineering takes time, and you want to have that small feedback loop. So that's why a test bench is really nice, because you're only dealing with the components you're targeting. The right there, you have no other noise. You can see the results. If remote, you wouldn't even be able to see what's going on. Like, you don't know that person
absolutely
lightly tapping the brake at that moment. It's like it'd be, and you don't know when they're gonna turn the car off. It would be just a mess. You wouldn't.
So it'll be like a bunch of work already done. You're ready. You know the structure of the CAN packets and everything. So you just want to perform the attack. That's what the remote setting is. All right.
And that's how normal server attacks work too. I mean, if you're attacking SSH, you probably download SSH and look through the source code. You're not on a remote server last minute trying to figure out an attack. I mean, it's possible, but it's definitely a little easier than attacking a car, but it's not likely. Usually you're going to go grab the binary and bring it back to you, so you have your own time to look at it. You're not going to do it at the target's location.
Got it. I mean, this is how, real life attacks, even those vast attacks, somebody, maybe a cleaning lady or someone would have access to the certificate or something. You need something. This is what I also, this is what I also try to, communicate to people, that there is always a social engineering aspect. Not always, most of the time, a social engineering aspect, which is attached to it, a real hacking. Not only car hacking.
Yes. Well, it's definitely easier to go that route. For instance, like there are these files called DBC files. It's basically a list of like what each packet does for each data. So if you had that, you wouldn't have to reverse engineer. And these things tend to leak pretty often, because performance tuners and stuff need them, and so people in the company will leak them for not that much money. And so you could save yourself a bunch of time by simply just buying them from a performance tuner. 100% non-technical, but works pretty well. Doesn't cost a whole lot of money. That does work. It does.
The objective is to steal the car, and if you can find a shortcut, the objective is to hack. So that's the way. So shifting gear a little bit. Coming back to your another mission you mentioned before we started this conversation, like Hackers Retirement Group, or what is it about? Tell us a little bit about the Hackers Retirement mission that you have.
Oh yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, so we were talking earlier about this. This year I'm planning on launching the Retired Hackers Collective. I got a website set up, rhc.club. It hasn't really been launched yet, but the concept is for people who are no longer working for larger companies, hackers that aren't doing that is what we're defining as retired. People who want to work more on their own or independently, building up a network of that to support each other. So this could be from investment advice to selling things to each other, passing on other things too. Like I get a lot of requests for work that I just can't take or I don't want to. I'm getting older. But there's other people that I need in the network that can do those types of things. So it's a network of that to kind of be self-sustainable. And so it's early stages, but sometime this year, I'm going to push a little harder and get this launched and build that community up for that kind of support. Us hacker groups are getting older now. We gotta still survive and settle down a bit. We're not young anymore, so that's what this group's for.
That sounds fascinating. Craig, is there any topic that you would like me to ask? Is there any question that I didn't ask you but you would like to talk about?
Nothing's coming to mind. I mean, bring up the retired hacker thing. That was a nice thing. Yeah, because if anybody wants to help with that, we're definitely at the stage of taking feedback. If you've run into problems in your past, like launching on your own or becoming like semi-retired, love to get feedback. Love to hear what would help you and support you. So anybody's interested, go ahead and go to rhc.club and you can jump on early or send me an email directly. And yeah, I would love to hear feedback.
Absolutely. All right, Craig. It was amazing having you. Thank you for sharing your insight. And I'm hoping to do a series of talks with you. And thank you so much again for being here.
Thank you. It was a very nice time having this conversation. Thank you.
So thank you so much for watching the episode. If you have questions, comments, please write in the comment section. We'll be more than happy to come back to you. And we'll see you in the next episode.